Well, hey there, Biology 11. Going to move on to 18.3. Our topic for 18.3 is kingdoms and domains. Now, there's a little bit more that we didn't talk about when we were describing Linnaean classification. We'd gone through kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Now, if you remember the mnemonic for that, or the way of remembering what that was, King Philip came over for good soup. Okay, that's a pretty good way to remember it. Nice, fairly harmless mnemonic and kind of easy to memorize. Now, what you have to take into consideration, though, is in all of these classifications, we're playing evolutionary sort of librarian and sorting out collections of living critters. There is a classification that's higher than the kingdom, higher than plantae and fungi and protista and all those ones that we know and love. It comes right down to it. We're going to look at whether or not does something have a nucleus or not, and then we've got one more consideration to make. So I'm going to pop in and start screen reflecting here. There we go. And present. There's some good stuff on the website I'll also point out to you, give you a chance to peruse and take in yourself. But here we go. Kingdoms and domains. So the tree of life evolves, absolutely. We have to adapt our sort of archival system, our librarian-like system, to fit into the model of everything that pops up on our planet. If it turns out that our classification system isn't quite flexible enough, or if we've misclassified something, then that's fine. We'll go back sort of to the well and figure out how it should be done. Linnaeus initially started with only really two kingdoms. He thought that pretty well everything was an animal or a plant. But quickly, the definition of kingdom expanded to take in a few extra things. I find myself always referring to this first one, Monerans. What that really is all about, there we go, is Monerans are essentially bacteria. But it turned out that wasn't quite precise enough because we have these very ancient bacteria on the planet known as archaebacteria, and we have sort of the Johnny come latelys or the Jane come latelys of bacteria like E. coli and, believe it or not, anthrax are relatively young bacteria. So Monerans, the old name, that had to expand. If you've ever gone out and taken a sample of pond water, you've probably seen a protist. So they're single-celled organisms. I think the most famous one is the paramecium. And if you look at that, sort of looks like a little guy like this with the little membrane and sort of has a little gullet that goes in like that and these fine little cilia hairs around the outside that help it to move. It's a ciliate. And it cruises around as a single cell looking for things to eat. You've also seen things like amoebas. They look a lot like your white blood cells. So when we look at the five kingdoms, you've kind of met a few of these. Fungi. I think we've all met fungi. The old mushroom cap, the old money's mushroom, right? Plantae. It's my best job at drawing a leaf. It's okay, go ahead and laugh. I'm drawing it on an iPad. There we go. Our plants, and then our animals. Kitty, kitty. Meow. I got a little cat. She's about 7 pounds. She's ferocious, so I'll draw her. There we go. She's a girl, so I'll throw in the eyelashes. There we go. So this was the five kingdom system. Turned out that this was pretty good, but it wasn't comprehensive enough. So let's move on. In comes the sixth kingdom. When you look at bacteria, what we say is that there are certain forms of bacteria. Let's switch up our... There's two distinct groups. We've got the eubacteria and then archaebacteria. Now, archae Like if you think of the word archaeology, archae means ancient. And eu is a Latin prefix which means quote unquote true. It's not like the archaebacteria aren't true bacteria, but the bacteria that you encounter every day, the bacteria that comes out in your feces, believe it or not, about 70% of your feces is bacteria. Gives a whole new definition to the term probiotic, doesn't it? We need them, as it turns out. Bacteria in our digestive tract helps us not only to digest our food, but to synthesize certain vitamins. One that comes to mind, E. coli helps us make vitamin K, and vitamin K helps with blood clotting. It's an essential nutrient. Let's zoom in here and take a look at some of our critters. Now, if we looked at something like E. coli, this would be fairly apt right here. These little rod-shaped or bacilli-shaped cells. But if we go and look at some of the more ancient cousins, we find the archaebacteria in some really crazy places in the world. These are archaebacteria that are chemotrophs, and I'll make a little note of that. But I'll have to switch colors. And by that, they make food by digesting. Turns out these guys like to chow down on methane, CH4. They can make energy from that. Methane, you might know that, that's natural gas. Very different. Here, what we're looking at, just looking at the kingdoms, right? We're looking at protists. And come down here, there's our plant kingdom. I get it. Mushrooms, very cool. For a long time, they were thought to be plants, but they don't photosynthesize, although they're kind of plant-like, and they have a very interesting cell wall. And here we are, the animals. I get it. But we have to go back to, there we go. We have to go back to our bacteria and consider that something like E. coli is heterotrophic. I mean, it goes out and finds a regular food source to consume. It's not trying to make its energy from base chemicals. When you look at the archaebacteria, these guys, they're looking for sulfur compounds. Not just your regular food source that these over here would be seeking. They kind of eat like us, but the archaebacteria, they're making their food from very primitive nutrients on our planet. Specifically chemicals. So what do we got? Here's what we've got. We've got a new distinction now with the archaebacteria. Let's go back to purple. Being their own kingdom, so they get a kingdom. Eubacteria. In fact, eubacteria are very different. If we look at the genetic code of eubacteria, they don't even, if we check over all their genes, they're ridiculously different from archaebacteria. And archaebacteria don't have the same kind of cell wall that you would find in eubacteria. Archaebacteria, when it comes to their cell wall, kind of have a lipidy, kind of waxy cell wall like us, whereas true bacteria like E. coli has sort of a carbohydrate cell wall. They're radically different. And it makes sense because they've lived apart. Archaebacteria are found in some of the most inhospitable places in the world, and we'll look at that in a minute. Kingdom Protista, Fungi, Plantae, and Animalia. So we've got 6 kingdoms to consider. Moving on. Neat little table, just more or less summarizes what happened in the 1700s. What we had when Linnaeus first started was just, oops, put that back, Linnaeus just had the initial 2. By the late 1800s, as microscopes got better, the work of Anton van Leeuwenhoek, we saw protists for the first time. They looked like little demons in the water. By the 50s, with microscopy getting much better, we were able to see bacteria, but we hadn't classified them into their two camps, which effectively by the 1990s, when I was going to school at UVic, yay UVic, split into two camps, and appropriately so. And the rest, as they say, is history. Moving up. We had to bring something in that was a little bit higher than a kingdom. So realize that when King Philip came over for good soup, I can fit it, I know I can, there we go, that we sort of thought this was the top, right? Where we thought the most specific, oops, undo, we went from a very broad classification to very specific, so I almost drew that upside down. Very broad to highly specific. Helps us to organize critters on our planet. There we go, the upside down triangle. But it turns out that we need to go one class higher. And we need to go to a domain. Now, it makes sense because there's something, if you think about it for just a second, if you're a protist, whether you're a protist, like a paramecium, or you're a human being, or whether you're a plant, or whether you are something along the lines of fungi, do all those groups actually share something in common? Well, it's true, we do. If you go down to, we're all eukaryotes, and if you go down to the level of being a eukaryote, it comes from an interesting little Latin series of terms. Eu, meaning, you're gonna let me highlight here? Oh, I have to go to this highlighter. Forgot. Fancy. Undo. Have to make your highlighters transparent. It works a little bit better that way. Alright. Comes from the term eu, which means true, and then we've got this karyo part, which means nucleus. So I like to annotate my slides, so you guys remember these. True nucleus. So what does that entail? It means even with the cell membrane and the cell wall and the cytoplasm and everything else, what you can rely on is that there is a nucleus, a membrane-bound nucleus in the cell, and what it contains is our genetic code, our deoxyribonucleic acid. So having a domain is something that plants, animals, fungi, and protists can all sort of share or be a part of a group of. So we found a higher degree of classification, and that's the way it should go. A good system should be able to be organized in a very smart way. Here's another way of looking at it. Whether or not you're a slime mold or fungi, plants, paramecium, little guys with tails, we're all in the group called eukaryotes. So that really means that as far as domains go, there's 3 domains. We'll zoom out a little bit here. And it's a little bit hard to see on this diagram, so what I like to do is, there we go, point out that this is one domain, so that's eukarya. Our friends, like our true bacteria, like our E. coli's and things like that, I really think of this as, sounds silly because bacteria is so ancient, but these are the more modern bacteria. And then over here on this branch we have exactly what it says here, the archaebacteria. So there's our 3 domains. So even though we have 6 kingdoms, there's one level above that, which is the domain level, and it all has to do in one part whether you've got a nucleus. And if it turns out that you don't, if you're a typical bacterium, you kind of put your genetic material in the middle, but there isn't a nucleus around it. It's sort of like yarn, like thread, and it's running throughout the cell, a little bit more concentrated in the middle, but it's not bound by a membrane. These bacteria over here have a an interesting cell wall, and genes that these bacteria over here do not share. And in fact, they don't even share the same cell wall. So they'll have genetic material as well, sort of threaded and aggregated into the middle of the cell. But there's sizable differences, which mean that these guys and these guys just do not fit into the same group. So we have 3 separate domains. We had to separate those guys. So I've harped on about this quite a bit. Eukarya, we've got our protists, anything with a nucleus basically. These guys. And then we've got our friends, the bacteria. Let's go with a nice yellow that you can see through. Ha, there we go. Bacteria. And we're talking about the true bacteria, okay? And put a little note, because I think almost everybody in the world knows about E. coli. By the way, the E stands for Escherichia. Sounds cool, doesn't it? I think so. And our archaebacteria, which will be last on our list, and they deserve their own color. Let's give them a freaky color. Let's give them an orange that you can see through. Nice. The archaeas. And since you need something to sort of remember the archaeas by, I would call them the sulfur eaters. Ooh, I lost it. And the methane munchers. And that would help you to remember that our friends are, now here's the full term, since they make their own food, they're chemo, auto, means they automatically make it, and trophs. There you go. Chemoautotrophs. Again, back to the picture. So we've made our camps very separate. True bacteria, archaebacteria. I should pop out for a second. I'm just curious if the next... I don't really like this slide. This just shows pretty well what branched off relative to the ancient ancestor. If we think back, there must have been some kind of a primitive life form that as it rose forward branched off into the bacterial branch, and then as sort of the second detour on the road of life, we got archaebacteria. And since archaebacteria are a little bit more genetically like us, they're sort of on our side of the road. We actually share more genes in common with them than we do with something like E. coli. So the archaebacteria took their own highway, went off and differentiated, but then some kind of an ancestor, some kind of primitive cell, moved on and became everything that we know to be our modern critters. Plants, animals, fungi, protists, paramecia, things like that. You get the idea. So domain bacteria, these guys are both friends and foes. Like I say, we find E. coli all over the place. You're born without E. coli, but the second that you begin to feed, breastfeed, come into contact with the world, you get them in your digestive canal, and you go probiotic right away. And they're pretty important to us. They've got a neat cell wall. So if you zoom in on it, actually, let's pop out. If you want to see, let's go with a bacterial cell wall. There we go. That's what I like about using an iPad. I can get right to it. A bacterial cell wall is an interesting sort of structure. If we looked at E. coli, there we go, and I mentioned that it has sort of that nucleus-like region, but it doesn't have a membrane. They call it a nucleoid. That's kind of neat. It's sort of fuzzy. It looks like a sort of giant fuzzy ice cream sandwich. But it does indicate the cell wall. Oh, I don't want to save a copy. If we look at their cell wall, what we can see is in this picture, it's sort of that brown, thick outer layer, and sometimes it's a thin layer that's sort of sandwiched in the middle. We'll talk about that more, but they tend to have this interesting sort of carbohydrate cell wall. It's very thick, and in something like um, anthrax, you would see that super thick outer wall, and we can use drugs to attack that. In fact, that's very vulnerable. The one on the right here is a little less vulnerable. Something like E. coli has the one that's on the right here, and something like bacillus, and you know bacillus by its more sort of generic term. Anthrax, you've kind of heard of that. It's more than a band. It, Anthrax would have more of this cell wall kind of on the left. And it's an interesting starch. It's very ancient. It's called peptidoglycan. You don't even see that in plants nowadays. Plants have a cellulose cell wall. So this peptidoglycan stuff is kind of neat. It is a starch. So you should make a side note. It's a starch, or a more properly called a carbohydrate. But it's unique, and they were doing cell walls way before plants. We do know that they are unicellular. So when you look at something like E. coli and it forms sort of a rod, it's just one cell. It may buddy up with some friends, but it lives its life as just a single cell. And it's prokaryotic, meaning, that's important to differentiate, pro means before there was, and karyo means nucleus. So before there was a nucleus, these critters existed. Okay, so here we go with the tables. I'm a little more interested right now in focusing on this. This is an electron micrograph showing them hanging out in your digestive tract. Pretty creepy, but they're definitely there. Wait for my thingamahoosit to adjust there. And let's go with kind of a green, because that'll work. So this does not have, if they had this, they would be a eukaryote. They don't have a membrane around all that stuff. It's just loose. So at this point, we say that they are prokaryotic, and they're so small. You have to realize this cell is as small, if not smaller, than the nucleus of your cell. They don't have room for all the wonderful cell organelles that we learned about once upon a time. Golgi bodies and mitochondria and chloroplasts. In fact, they're about that size. All these things really have space for is genetic material, little protein-making ribosomes, and some cytoplasm. They're pretty tiny. So here's the full classification. Let's make sure we don't mess this up. They're in domain bacteria. They're the true bacterial variety. They're prokaryotic. They've got that peptidoglycan. They're single cells. These guys, as it turns out, can photosynthesize like plants. So they get a big old yes on the autotrophic. And if you've ever seen blue-green algae, that green, bluey, foamy scum out at Clucas Lake, for example, in Prince George, that's bacteria that photosynthesizes floating around on the surface of the lake. But something like E. coli in your gut lining is happily living off the food you're consuming as well, and giving you a little vitamin K in return, right? That's a good deal. So we've got autotrophic bacteria, we've got heterotrophic. They can automatically make their own food to eat. That's what autotroph means. Or they have to eat something else, and that's what heterotroph means. So there you go. Archaebacteria. Here's that little point about them lacking peptidoglycan. They don't have that carbohydrate, and they kind of have really unusual material in their outer sort of membranes. And it turns out that it's oil-like, and our cell membrane is oil-like. It's composed of lipids. So you can see right there's a degree of relationship between us and them. These guys are pretty ancient. I like this slide, but I'm going to show you more. This would be sort of like a volcanic area, really hot, lots of sulfur around. What you would get is you would get acidic conditions. They absolutely love it. In fact, they love these conditions. They like to be away from anything that resembles oxygen if they can, because when they were born on our planet, there wasn't an oxygenated atmosphere. And to them, it's toxic. If you think to yourself, well, why would oxygen be toxic? Back up a little bit and think about what oxygen does to vehicles. Look what it does to iron. It rusts it. In fact, we paint our vehicles just to protect them from oxygen. It's some pretty nasty stuff that you and I couldn't live without. Well, here's another example of nasty stuff. You take sodium. The element sodium is extremely reactive. It's one of the nastiest materials on the planet. Very poisonous, very toxic. And you take chlorine, like chlorine gas, and you know how toxic that is. Put those two together, what do you get? Table salt. We can't live without it. Oxygen, again, one of the things on our planet that can break things down very effectively, rusts and corrodes things, but you and I can't live without it. Interesting. Interesting how the tree of life works, right? It's not a surprise. Okay, so let's pop out to blue. We're in archaebacteria. They're in kingdom. Archaebacteria, I think that's a little redundant. They don't have a nucleus, so they're prokaryotes. No peptidoglycan. That's a big reason to take them away from the Monarans. Or Monarans, see, I did it again. To take them away from the eubacteria group. Single-celled. They can make their own energy or eat things. And what do they like? Turns out that these bacteria, we had our methane eaters, you remember them, but it turns out that these guys like salt. Halo is a term that means salt. So if you went into the Dead Sea and you took a bacterial sample, odds are if you found anything alive, you would probably find archaebacteria. Now, not to make you afraid, but since they like heat and really drastic conditions, archaebacteria love living in things like your hot tub. That's why we add chemicals. We find archaebacteria in some of the darndest places. We find them down deep in the ocean, in what we call black smokers, living off of sulfur compounds that are coming up out of the, that are coming up basically from the earth. You have to understand how hot this is. Because it's way down deep in the ocean, there's very little oxygen, which means the archaebacteria are fairly happy. They would like to get away from it if they can. It's very acidic. It's very hot. Right now, because of the pressure of the ocean water, this water is above boiling. And they're living in those little white snotty drips, kind of like snotites, which we see in our video by Neil deGrasse Tyson, snotites, where he looks at these snotty little drips where bacteria are living in mucus just to protect themselves from the acidity of the cave. And they're living off of sulfur compounds, which is why this person is wearing a respirator, because it's kind of a nightmare. Sulfuric acid, you can't breathe that in, and you get the idea. Very neat stuff. Snotites. And they're living off the sulfur compounds, so that acid drip material for them is just a food source. They're chemoautotrophs. I love how they named it. Snotites. Awesome job, guys. All right. Need to sneak back. So there we go. Getting away from the archaebacterial domain and getting away from the eubacterial domain puts us into our happy little group. So even though you might not know it, this is a kind of protist. It causes red tide. Here we've got plants. And we've got us animals. Certainly are. You should see them on a Friday night. And fungi. Not very much in this group, but we're certainly doing a lot on the planet. There we go. Protists, they go on a little bit about these guys in detail. They can take a variety of shapes and forms. You have to go with what you know. So with protists, you'll think about things like paramecia, and we saw a picture of that, and our little blob-like, oops, little blob-like amoebas. I like to spell it the traditional way. Oop, come on, there you. There we go. But there's also some really neat-looking members of this kingdom. This is really the kingdom of cells that you cannot call animals, plants, or fungi. They're just not. They are not animals, plants, or fungi, because those things, if you're an animal, plant, or fungi, you're absolutely committed. You, if you're in this group, let's put a big old bubble around that, are multi-celled. You have to be. But guess what? There is a kingdom out there where if you choose to, you can live your whole life as a single cell. Sometimes this multicellular thing is kind of goofy. I tend to think it's a little bit mislabeled. Ooh, I'll do handwriting for once. I tend to think of it as they're colonial. So they can get together and hang out and be friends, right? Bacteria do that. But these guys, amoebas and paramecia, they could live their whole life as a single cell if they so choose. So the protists can be animal-like, going around eating other things. They can even be plant-like. There are some protists that can make their own food with sunlight. There's some protists that act like fungi and decompose things. But this group, you have to nail this, is the only group that can live its life as a single cell. We can't do that. Plants, animals, fungi, forget it. Multicellularity is mandatory. Not for protists, it's not. Fungi, interestingly enough, fungi aren't in the IRPs or the learning guides of the course, which I think is just crazy because it is a full kingdom in this course. They're heterotrophic, like us. They go around eating other things. They can also be quite parasitic. If you've ever had athlete's foot, that burning feeling is them trying to sort of digest the tissues of your foot. They secrete these little enzymes, and although we see these ones here like a bread mold, kind of neat, and you get this disgusting kind of wall fungus right here. There we go. This kind of mold. They tend to like really warm, moist environments. A friend of mine in China actually has a dehumidifier to pull the water out of the air so that the mold doesn't grow so badly on our walls. These guys are living off anything they find in the soil. They're just breaking it down. If you've left an orange in your locker too long, penicillin mold will come along and destroy it. So when you look at fungi, they're pretty well almost all the time multicellular. Now there's always these weird exceptions to the rule, but they're exceptions, not rules. When you look at yeast, they're kind of single-celled organisms, but they're more fungus-like than protist-like. That's where we start to get into an interesting area when we talk about multi-celled or single-celled. Yeast is definitely a fungus. We're going to stick with it. I've got to show you penicillin mold. You must see it. If you leave that orange in your locker too long, let's go with an orange. There we go. We find that our oranges start to turn into these slimy masses as the fungi have their way with them. So, lucky us. When it's locker cleanout time, we start to find this stuff. And that bluish, kind of greenish, whitish stuff is the mold. It's infiltrated the tissues. At this point, you cannot eat. You cannot eat this. But what we found out was kind of interesting is this is where we got penicillin from. These little mold guys, to protect their food, produce this substance, penicillin, and it keeps bacteria away. It's a very interesting little compound. Is that where some antibiotics came from? Absolutely, from fungi. So when you get your oranges at Costco or wherever you buy them at Christmas, check your check them over for see if they're wet or slimy, because mold is, odds are mold's probably already moved in. It's taken over. So fungi are what we call decomposers. Okay, the great decomposers. And another word for that is we say that they're saprophytes. I'll marry you. Saprophytes, saprophytic. There we go. Plants, I think we know these guys pretty well. We call them autotrophs, but we say the source of their food is photosynthesis. Remember the archaebacteria a minute ago, we said that they were chemoautotrophs. The source of their automatic food creation is the chemicals that they encounter in the black smokers or in the sulfur drips in the caves. Plants by nature are just kind of non-mobile, although there's exceptions to that. Venus flytrap can move to sort of capture its food. They've got a neat little compound, right? It's a new carbohydrate, not peptidoglycan, that they're using to support their tissues. So we call it cellulose. I think we know these guys pretty well. And then there's us, the animals. I love this little reference to the Blue Man Group. I saw them in Las Vegas. So a little plug for the Blue Man Group. Awesome. Very fun to watch. But what really means being an animal? What does that mean? It means that we have to eat other things. Unfortunately, we're committed. We're heterotrophs, and you're not going to find an animal that doesn't have multiple cells. I mean, look at how our cells are differentiated. We've got cells on the surface of our skin, and we've got, let's see if I can get my tool, there we go. We've got specialized cells for our eyes, and specialized cells in our ears, cells that make hair. We have all this differentiation. Cells in our brain. Ooh, he's blue, I can't use that. Going with yellow. Right? We have our brain cells. Right? By the way, your eye, technically, the structure of your eye is specialized nervous tissue. We have muscle for locomotion, specialized muscle for digesting. That's the whole reason we went multicellular, so that we could use lots of different types of cells to do lots of different things in our body. Okay, so this was 18.3. I hope you enjoyed it. It's neat doing a screencast because I have time to really kind of kick back, lay back, and talk about a lot of things that I would have to kind of hurry through class with. And plus, you have the advantage, fast forward me, pause me, mute me, and I won't even take offense. All right, folks, have a good one. I am done. One more screencast. Sayonara.